Welcome to this webinar. Good morning if you are in North America. Zhang, our speaker, and I are both in the US. It's early morning for Zhang in Chicago. I'm in New York. Most of you are perhaps in China or Asia, so good evening to you. I'm really honored to welcome Zhang to give this talk on her forthcoming book. She is now currently finishing the manuscript comparing three different countries, three different urban issues. Zhang Ye now is an associate professor of political science and global Asian studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She actually did her undergraduate at my alma mater as well, Peking University, before she went to Princeton to do her master's and PhD. On the slide, you see her first book, The Fragmented Politics of Urban Preservation, Beijing, Chicago, and Paris. That book did not cover India, but this forthcoming book has three different countries as well, Brazil, China, and India. And then so we are looking forward to the book and her talk. Zhang Ye is going to speak for about 45 minutes, followed by Q&A. On your Zoom screen at the very bottom, you have a Q&A box. You can start writing your questions as Professor Zhang is speaking. After she has done a presentation of her forthcoming book, I'll be moderating the Q&A, and that will be about 15-20 minutes as well. So please join me in welcoming Professor Zhang on very exciting project, comparative urbanization, which methodologically is quite interesting. And because she covers three different countries, the issues of urbanization globally is quite important as well. So Zhang, the screen is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Tencent, for such a nice introduction. Hello, everyone. Greetings from Chicago. Good morning, good evening, no matter where you are. First of all, I want to thank Professor Zhang for inviting me. It's such a great honor to participate in the speaker series of the Center for Global Asia. I also would like to thank Haozhe and his colleagues for their kind assistance. Like I was talking to them before the seminar, everything is so well organized, and it's great to see all the audience. Especially I see some, some names of the friends I met before, and also, some new faces. So it's really great to see you all. So now let me share my screen with you. Are you able to see the screen?
Yeah, Zhang, it's fine.
Okay,
you can make
great.
it, yeah.
Okay, great. So like Tencent mentioned, this is my forthcoming book. So it's about housing inequality, urban governance in China, India, and Brazil. So, today my talk will be, having four major parts. First of all, I will set the stage of comparison by talking about a general picture of urbanization, informality, and pose the research questions. I will then talk about my argument and the theory, and I will spend more time sharing with you a few case studies of the book. And finally, I'll discuss the conclusion and some implications of the research. Okay, so as many of us know, urbanization is considered one of the most significant global trends of the 21st century. In 1900, only 16% of the world's population lived in cities. And as you see from the figure, the number is over 50% today, and it's expected to reach 70% by 2050. And countries and cities in the global south are the major location for future population growth. About 87% of future world population growth will take place in the urban areas of the global south. So not only we see there is this rapid increase of urban population, but also cities are becoming bigger and bigger. In 1950, there were only 2 cities in the world, each with a population of over 10 million. They are New York and Tokyo. But today there are 34 cities in the world, considered as mega cities, and 29 of them are in the global south. At the same time, we see that cities have become the major drivers of economic growth. The world's 300 largest cities produce over half of the global GDP. So we know, cities and urbanization is always associated with human development and progress, and we're, celebrating the triumph of the city. I know many of you are, city lovers, including myself. However, if we go to the global cities or mega cities, we will know the reality on the ground is actually much more complicated. So this is a photo I took in Mumbai during my fieldwork in 2016. It's near the Banjokula complex. This is a major commercial district of the city. So you see on one side of the highway, there is this complex of modern office buildings. On the other side, there is this endless expansion of informal settlements. This is a photo I took in Rio de Janeiro. It's during my very first visit to a favela. Favela refers to informal settlements in Portuguese, and many of this informal housing was built on the mountain. And so as you see from the photo here, they're facing the ocean, and the view was very, very nice. And some of the communities were created back to the 19th century, and they were the birthplace of some important art forms in Brazil, such as samba. But those places also face many challenges, like, those communities are controlled by drug dealers. So not only you see concentrated poverty, but also there is a lot of violence and crime in those communities. So we can see that a very important phenomenon of urbanization in the global south is the proliferation of informal settlements. So in my study, I define informal settlements as housing development beyond planning regulations. It's often associated with insecure tenure, substandard living conditions, and limited services. So here to give you some data about the scale of informality. So like I mentioned earlier, more than half of the world's population lived in cities, and 1/3 of the world's urban population lived in informal settlements. That's over 1 billion people. The majority of them are in the developing world, and the size is expected to triple by 2050. And in many cities, we see that population growth in informal settlements has constantly been faster than the growth rate of the entire city. And there is a huge global affordable housing gap, stands at $650 billion a year, and is still growing. And a significant amount of this gap is concentrated in the global, in the 100 largest cities in the world. So some scholars argue that we are living on a planet of slums, where urban growth is outside state control. So you see, as I was traveling to different mega cities, global cities, especially cities in the global south, I was, wondering, I was very curious. So how do we make sense of this scale of informality, and are informal settlements really ungovernable stateless territories? So in order to address those issues, I decided to study informal settlements and urban governance in 3 countries: China, India, and Brazil. Okay, so we know the 3 countries are very different at the national level in terms of history, culture, political institution, economic development, social structure. However, they have all undergoing rapid economic development and urbanization in recent decades. As from the figure here, it's the comparison of their GDP growth and urbanization rate in the recent decades. And the orange color indicates China, purple is India, green is Brazil. The column is their GDP growth, and the line indicates the urbanization level. So as you see, China has undergone a dramatic urbanization since 1980s. That's associated with the economic reform and opening up. So more migrant workers moved to urban areas. India's urban growth has been pretty steady over the decades. And in fact, because India has a very restrictive definition of urban. It's more strict by lots of countries in the world. Scholars argue if we use the global standards, India actually has a much higher urbanization level, which is around 52%. And Brazil, you see, it has a much earlier start of urbanization compared to India and China, largely due to its coffee industry and the strategy of import substitution from the late 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. So now Brazil has one of the highest number of urbanization rate in the world. And if we look at the three countries, the combined urban population of the three countries exists that of Europe and North America. So you can call them actually as three urban giants. At the same time, there is a high level of informal settlements, in all the three countries. In China, over 37% of this urban population lived in informal settlements. In India, the number is over 55%. In Brazil, it's over 36%. At the same time, in all the three countries, there are large redevelopment projects going on in their major cities in the informal settlements. So despite all those differences, you can see, the mega cities of those countries, especially their informal settlements, can provide pretty fertile ground for comparison. And also, I want to mention that, like I was discussing with Tencent earlier, there is a very rich intellectual tradition of China-Indian studies. Professor Zhang actually has an excellent article on this topic. I highly recommend all of you to read it. But you see, by including Brazil to this comparison, we can expand the scope and can possibly develop a more complete picture of global urbanism. Okay, so here are the questions I try to answer in my book, two sets of questions. First, I want to understand if one of the basic tasks of the state is to maintain order, then why are informal settlements so prevalent and persistent across China, India, and Brazil? And secondly, how does redevelopment take place in the informal settlements of the three countries? And what explains the different processes and outcomes of redevelopment? Okay, so this is basically, the stage of my comparison. And now I want to go into my argument and the theory. But before I do so, I want to introduce you to the literature, how people have been studying informality. The term informal sector was first coined by British anthropologist Keith Hart in his study of local economy in Ghana, and later was elaborated by the International Labour Organization in their work on Kenya. So you see, although the study of informality started from Africa, it actually has been expanded to the globe. So there is a rich literature studying different realms of urban informality, informal economy, employment, land use, housing, and also covering different world regions from Africa to Latin America to Asia. And also I want to emphasize informality also exists in the global north. So, for instance, in 19th century England, there is lots of, slum housing in their emerging cities, and also during Industrial Revolution, where the urban poor lived. And even today in the United States, between the US-Mexican border, you see some housing called colonia. That's where, some urban poor and undocumented immigrants lived. Okay. So in the literature, a very important focus is how is informality produced, right? So there are two major schools of theory. The first is structuralist approach. It argues that informality is a symptom of underdevelopment. It's caused by global capitalism and the failure of the state. So for instance, many countries have adopted the structural adjustment program promoted by the International Monetary Fund since the 1990s. So in other words, in order for those countries to get loans from IMF, they must privatize their economy and open up their markets. So those policies actually destroyed their agriculture sector and their local industry. So many people lost jobs, and the farmers came to cities from countryside, but they cannot find jobs either. So we call this urbanization without industrialization. And the state failed to provide services, welfare to people. So many people settled in the informal sector. And the second approach is called the legalist approach. It argues that informality is actually the result of too much state regulation, right? So the more you regulate, the more informality, inequality you will see in the economy. So the solution is to deregulate. So the literature provides a very strong foundation for us to understand, to study the phenomena of informality. But I argue there are two, weaknesses in the literature. First of all, it largely neglects the diversity within the informal sector. For instance, when we talk about informal housing, it's often treated as a unitary sector. And secondly, although the structuralist and the legalist approaches are different, they actually share a major similarity in terms of the role of the state. So they consider state absence or state failure as the major source of informality. So in other words, informality is something beyond the reach of the state. So in my study, I try to challenge some of the existing propositions. And here's my argument, 3 parts. First, I argue that informal housing practice has become the norm in the global south, and yet is highly differentiated. Second, informal settlements are not stateless territories. They are produced by the state. And third, different modes of urban governance are the key for understanding the redevelopment of informal settlements. Okay, I want to elaborate my last point about urban governance. Urban governance basically is the process or the arrangements by which different state and non-state actors work together to make and implement governing decisions. So in my book, I shows that urban governance actually has 2 dimensions: the effectiveness of governance and the inclusiveness of governance. So effectiveness of governance refers to the role of the state actors. So whether the state is able to mobilize resources, reach decisions, and take actions to carry out the decisions. And inclusiveness is the role of the non-state actors, whether they are able to participate in policymaking and whether they can have their interests represented, reflected in the decisions. So you see here we have a 2x2 dimension here. So the 2 dimensions are important for understanding how urban governance takes place. And each dimension is ranging from low to high. So we basically get some ideal types here, right, of urban governance. So at the upper right corner, I call it integrated model, where you would have a higher level of effectiveness and a higher inclusiveness. Usually you'll see coordination between different levels of government, a strong bureaucracy, coherent party system, and also institutionalized channels of participation. Then at the lower right corner, you have the directive model of governance. So the effectiveness is high, but inclusiveness is low. So usually you have a powerful state capable of mobilizing resources and people, but there's limited participation. So this kind of policy implementation can be effective, but it's often associated with social cost and repression. And on the upper left corner, you have contested model where, the degree of inclusiveness is high, but effectiveness is low. So usually you will see contestation, conflicts between different actors, both inside and outside the state apparatus, and different social actors try to challenge the state. So there is more democratic, more participation and more inclusiveness, but the implementation is relatively slow. And finally, at the lower left corner, you have transitional model where you usually see political fragmentation within the state apparatus and the limited channels of participation. So politics usually takes place through negotiation and even clientelistic exchanges between state and non-state actors under this model. So of course, those 4 are just ideal types, right? And in reality, we see cases are usually not really at the corners, not really at the very end of the axis. They are more in the middle. And also we see there's the combination of different traits in each country. And so roughly you see lots of traits of directive governance in China. and also some East Asian developmental state. You'll see the directive model there. And Brazil actually shows a very strong trait of contested governance. And many Indian cities fall in the category of transactional governance. So like I mentioned, those are ideal types, and we really need to pay attention to the texture of their governance, to the mechanism of governance. But my purpose of creating this is to give us a tool, to compare different countries and cities. Okay, so in the book, I look at 4 types of informal settlements. So kind of to see how the model of urban governance, which I proposed earlier, help us understand the redevelopment in those informal settlements. And today, in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on 3 of them. I'm going to talk about urban villages in Guangzhou, squatter settlements in Mumbai, and movement occupations in São Paulo. And very quickly about my data and methods. So this is a qualitative study, and I did lots of field work, interviews, observation in the housing communities, and some archival research. I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A session if you have questions. Okay, now let's come to the fun part, talk about the cases. So first of all, let's take a look at urban villages in Guangzhou. So these are the rural areas encircled by urban expansion, as you see from the photo here, right? All those modern buildings, and there is a village in the middle. So in the process of China's rapid urbanization, the local government expropriate the land from villagers, mainly their agricultural land. And to reduce conflicts and to reduce cost, they usually leave alone the village themselves. So villagers want to make a living, so they build multi-story apartment buildings on their homestead and lease those buildings, those apartment units, to migrant workers. And then we see the formation of urban villages. So in other words, this is not something being totally ignored. It's actually something produced by the state. It's the production of the state's selective land expropriation. And different from squatter settlements, the villagers collectively own the land, so they have land ownership. But the housing construction and the rental business in the urban villages is not subject to any regulation. So that's why we call it informal settlements. Guangzhou has a population of over 15 million, and nearly 38% of them live in urban villages. The majority of them are the rural migrants who do not have local hukou. So as many of you know, hukou was created in the 50s as this mechanism to control the mobility of a population. And there is a very interesting overlapping leadership in urban villages. So each village has a village committee elected by the people. Also, they have this party committee. That's the grassroots branch of the Chinese Communist Party. And also by the 90s, most villages have created a shareholding company to manage their collective properties. And the villagers are shareholders, and then they receive cash dividends every year. And then all the villagers still have very strong clan networks. So that's a major difference between the villages in northern China and southern China. So the key figures in all those organizations, is basically the same group of people. So you see the overlapping of leadership, and that actually creates lots of bargaining power for the villagers during redevelopment. So Guangzhou, in the city limits, there is a total of 139 urban villages. I don't know how many of you have been there, but this is what it looks like if you walk inside an urban village. You see the buildings are very close to each other. So it's called handshaking buildings or kissing buildings. You can shake hands, you can kiss someone through the window. And also all the urban villages have a street markets where you can buy everything, also lots of restaurants. So life was very convenient. Now let's take a look at the redevelopment. The redevelopment of urban villages started in 2009. It's part of the provincial government's plan of economic restructuring. And the strategy is called empty the cage and let the right birds in. So the basic idea is to replace the labor-intensive manufacturing industry with a high-tech industry. So they need to build more upscale housing and facility for people working in the high-tech industry. At the same time, there is a shortage of land. So the government feel this need to recycle land, which is already in use. So redevelopment of urban villages in Guangzhou is a collective action of central planning and local initiatives. So like I said earlier, it's a very directive model of urban governance. You see lots of state capacity here. The central and provincial governments set the agenda of redevelopment, and the municipality translates the agenda into specific policy and assign tasks to local officials. And the district's government and the street affairs offices, they would send work teams made of local officials to each village, mobilize village cadres, and persuade villagers to cooperate. So, it's a collective action. At the same time, you see this pro-growth coalition between local officials and the developers, because both sides want to push forward redevelopment and maximize profit from land use. And my research I find very interesting thing is that state-owned enterprises have a very special advantage here, in being, issuing, getting the privilege to develop certain projects because they have a strong connection with the state. It's also easier for the state-owned enterprises to get loans from the state banks. So in the process of redevelopment, the village committees are the important intermediaries. So they would select developers on behalf of the villagers. They will also negotiate with developers. Okay, so this is what it looks like after redevelopment. So as you see, the process is to demolish the old village and build a new apartment building on the village land. The developers need to provide compensation units for the villagers. And also they can use the rest of the land to build luxury housing, commercial facilities for sale. So the villagers really, they bargain very hard with the developers. So the developers have to provide them as many compensation units as possible. So the developers will increase the density of the building. So that's why you see here the density is so high. Some of the buildings are 46-story high. And this kind of high density actually, it actually broke the zoning regulation. So some urban planners I spoke to told me, this is informality, this is informal settlements because that's against the state regulation. So the villagers, receive multiple condo units in the city center. They became the rich housing class. However, the migrant tenants, people who do not have local hukou, they were evicted. And they have to move to other villages further away from the center of the city. Interesting episode is the developers would rebuild the ancestral shrines for the villagers after redevelopment. In one of the villages I visited, there are 4 major clans. The village and the developers build one ancestral shrine for each clan. And it's magnificent structure, as you see from the photos. And I walked inside. I want to see, how villagers are using the space. Then I see there were some of the male senior villagers were playing mahjong inside. Okay, so this is the story, different treatment of villagers and migrant workers through redevelopment. It's lots of inequality in this process. And now let's take a look at what happened in India. So squatter settlements is also called slums in local context and also in the governmental documents in India. They are the self-built housing on public or private land. People don't have legal tenure. So that's a major difference between urban villages and squatter settlements. Mumbai's population is over 12 million. About 42% of them live in slums. Slum dwellers are highly heterogeneous in terms of their ethnicity, religions, socioeconomic status. But also, those slums are very complex ecological and economic systems, which I will show you in just 1 minute. So why we see such a large scale of slums in Mumbai? There are a couple of reasons. There was limited supply of social housing in the city. And Mumbai's geography was constrained by the ocean, so the land area is very small. But there is also a very important rent control policy, which was introduced in Mumbai in the 40s. According to the rent control policy, the landlords have to set their rents at or below a standard rents set by the court. So in other words, regardless of inflation or other issues, you cannot increase your rent too much. You can see the purpose is to protect tenants, but it actually undermined the interests of landlords. So there was very little interest in building and providing rental housing. And in 1960s, Mumbai introduced a restrictive land use policy. So the policy controlled the density of new construction. You cannot build too high. So the purpose is to control population growth of large cities, not only in Mumbai, but in other parts of India, and to slow down urbanization. But actually, you see, the policy didn't work, right? Because people come to cities anyway. They come to cities for job opportunities. When there is no housing, people build their own shelters. And over the years, the slums have become so-called vote banks. So the politician would provide services, would help people register as voters and provide services during election seasons, and people will offer votes. So this kind of arrangements stabilizes the slums. So again, as you see, there's different economic and political institutions, policies made by the state, which produces and stabilizes the informal settlements. This is a photo I took in Dhaaravi. As you know, this is the largest slum in Asia. Maybe many of you have seen the movie Slumdog Millionaire. It was shot there. So this is a very large area. It has over 1 million residents. Also lots of micro industries like pottery, plastic recycling, tanning, and leather working. The annual industrial output of this area was between 600 million to 1.5 billion US dollars. So it's an important economic entity in the city. So I took this photo outside some pottery shops, as you know, very beautifully handmade crafts, and it was sold all over the country. And this is the plastic recycling industry in Dhaaravi. The photo on the left shows you, so this gentleman was the president of the All Plastic Recyclers Association of India, and he is also a longtime resident of Dhaaravi. Okay, now let's take a look at the redevelopment. Slum redevelopment in Mumbai was launched in 1995. Is the local party Shiv Sena party's decision to a campaign promise to provide free housing to all slum dwellers. So Shiv Sena is a regional party based in the Maharashtra state where Mumbai is located. It's a right-wing nationalist Hinduist party. So this proposal of provide free housing to slum dwellers was supported by the real estate industry because, you know, developers want to make money from slum land. It's also supported by the urban middle class because they want to enhance the image of Mumbai as a world-class city. But different from Guangzhou, where the local government, the city government played a central role in redevelopment, here in Mumbai, redevelopment is implemented by the state government through the agency called the Slum Redevelopment Authority. So that's a major difference between China and India, because in India, all the urban issues are managed by the state government. City officials have almost very little power. That's also one reason why you see limited service provision in Indian cities. So the process of redevelopment goes like such. If the developer has a consensus of 70% slum dwellers in one area, then he can get the land from the government at very low price, only 25% of market value. And then in order for slum dwellers to receive free housing, they must meet a cutoff date of 2000. January 1st, 2000, which means they must have documents to show they have settled in this area before this date. And this date has been extended multiple times because developers want to enlarge their vote banks, want to benefit more people so they can have more votes. And also the redevelopment is in situ, which means slum dwellers got housing on the same slum land. Why is that? Because developers don't want to lose their vote banks. This is a example to show you what happens after redevelopment. Imperial Towers in south part of Mumbai. It's built in 2007. It's you know those two white towers in the photo on the top. They are the Imperial Towers. They used to be the tallest buildings of Mumbai, 60 floors, and still is one of the most expensive properties in the city. And they were built on slum land. And the darker lower building in front of them is the compensation housing for slum dwellers. So as you can see from the other two photos, you know, a cell unit in the Imperial Towers is very expensive, very upscale. And the other one shows you a standard rehabilitation unit for slum dwellers in that building. So no matter how many people are in the family, you know, all the compensation units are 25 square meters. So you see, although slums are cleared through redevelopment, this kind of inequality has been reproduced through slum redevelopment, and the slum dwellers and the upper class are living next door to each other. Okay, now let's come to the last case. I'm going to take you to Brazil. So if you walk around in the city center of São Paulo, you often see buildings like this. So you would be wondering, you know, what happens to this building, you know, the graffiti and all the things hanging there. So these are the buildings occupied by the housing movements in São Paulo. The housing movements started in downtown São Paulo in the early 90s, when lots of people working downtown do not have a place to live. They, you know, launched a movement to occupy empty buildings in the city. So since the beginning of the movement, over 120 buildings have been occupied. They provided a home to over 10,000 families. And average time of occupation was 5 to 6 years. So we need to understand this in the background of severe housing inequality in São Paulo. So as I show you here, the citywide housing deficit is nearly 700,000. At the same time, you have the number of vacant units around 500 units. So why is there such a high vacancy rate in São Paulo? You know, historically, the downtown area of the city was the economic center, inhabited mainly by the upper class. But because São Paulo began going through the process of deindustrialization in 1970s, lots of elites moved away from the center to the southwest region of the city. At the same time, the government reduced investment in infrastructure, so that leads to more deterioration and pushing more people out of the city. And then in 2008, during the financial crisis, you know, lots of, you know, property owners were really undermined. So the housing market was hit hard. Lots of people cannot pay the taxes, so they abandoned their properties. Lots of the abandoned buildings are office buildings or hotel buildings. At the same time, still 64% of jobs in Metro São Paulo are concentrated in the city center. So you see the coexistence of people, of, you know, homeless people and the people with homes in the city center. And that's the background for this housing movement. Also, I want to emphasize that different from China and India, Brazil has a very strong tradition of social movements. It's influenced by the Christian liberation theology, which emphasizes the liberation of the oppressed. There's also a workers' party in Brazil called the PT. That's a left-wing party and has played a central role in organizing and supporting social movements. So in terms of the housing movements in the city center of São Paulo, it was a unified movement at the beginning, but then dispersed into over 20 different movements. But they were still under the centralized guidance of the Gaspar Garcia Center for Human Rights. And then they received wide social support. I remember when I was doing interviews in São Paulo, some municipal officials told me they donate money to the movement every month. I was very surprised, right? Because the government officials, they were supposed to regulate this kind of illegality, this kind of violation of property rights. So I asked them why they do so. So they told me, you know, I donate money as a private citizen and I support their struggle for the right to housing. Okay, so those movements have very rigorous internal organization. Basically, if you want to live in a building, you need to submit an application. And so the photo on the left shows you the application form. And usually most people can be admitted, and then they need to pay a small amount of rent. The rent will be used as public funds. So they can pay utilities. They can also build some facilities inside the building. And every resident will have a permit. They must show the permit when they want to enter the building. And other residents work shifts at the entrance to check permits and to maintain building safety. The photo on the right shows you the information of residents' work shifts that I took at the entrance of a building. And also, smoking or drinking is not allowed, and visitors must leave the building by 10 p.m. So lots of regulations. Also, they have lots of facilities. The photo on the upper right corner is a children's playroom in one occupation. All the furnitures were donated by a local school. And the building on the right corner, lower right corner is they are having a weekly meeting in a occupation. So the leader was explaining to people how the public funds was used and what's the situation of their struggle, of their negotiation. And then the other photo shows the two leaders were showing me the flag of their movement. It says Downtown Homeless Movement. So the movements are able to use lots of legal and participatory devices to justify their claims, to support their, their occupation. So as some of you know, Brazil had a 20-year military dictatorship from 1964 to 1985. And after that, the country redemocratized and passed a new constitution in 1988. And then a few years later, in 2001, Brazil passed a legal document called the City Statute. Both of them are very progressive, and they created a highly progressive legal system in the country, which Brazil is known for internationally. So according to the legal system, housing is a basic right, and the properties should fulfill social functions. So in other words, if you leave your property empty for a long time, you are not fulfilling social function. And the law also protects squatters' rights through a tool called adverse possession. It means if a low-income person doesn't own a property, and if he occupies a private property to live, and if he can stay in the place for 5 years and the owner doesn't take any legal action, then after 5 years, he can claim his ownership over the property. So movement leaders are able to use all those legal documents to justify their action. At the same time, there's the Municipal Housing Council was created all over Brazil as a way for the communities to participate in housing policy making. And usually 1/3 of people on the housing council are from the government, state and municipal officials, 1/3 are from the social movements, and 1/3 are from civil society and professional organizations. So we see those institutions, legal participatory devices, contribute to the longevity and the scale of the movements. And meanwhile, the movements try to urge the city government to redevelop some of the occupation into social housing and to negotiate with the court to postpone eviction. And this process is actually very contentious and very slow. So there is this ambiguity in the legal system. You see, like I mentioned earlier, the movements can use the constitution, the city statute to justify their occupation, but the property owners can also use civil law to justify their property rights, right? So there's the conflicts in the legal principles. At the same time, you see there are different political cleavages in the city. In the city hall, you often have the conflicts between the left-wing party and the right-wing party, because the mayor need to build the party coalition, so he need to try to work with everyone. And oftentimes, even though the mayor is from the workers' parties, the PT mayor who's supportive to the movement, you have a state governor from the conservative party. So the city doesn't have enough support from the state, not enough resources. And even though you have the executive body, which is progressive, the country still has a conservative judiciary. So lots of judges, they still do not support the claims of the movements. So all those political cleavages, the process is highly contentious. One story very quickly is the Mawa occupation. That's a photo you see on the slide. So this is a hotel which was abandoned in the 80s. And the movement occupied it in 2007. So they were occupying it. Over 200 families live there, and they want to claim adverse possession over this property. So in 2012, just 4 days before the occupation reached the 5-year benchmark, the owner appeared to the court and requested the repossession of the property. So that leads to years of negotiation and contestation. So eventually in 2015, the city government purchased the building and turned it into social housing. So until today, the city has appropriated over 30 occupations and converted them into social housing. So as you see, the process is highly contentious, the conflicts within and also outside the state apparatus. So finally, I want to talk a little bit about, the conclusion and the implication of the study after we travel the whole world, right? So on informality, we can see that informal settlements are highly differentiated in terms of the property rights, construction, and the access to services. So we see the literature often pays attention to the difference between the formal and the informal, but we really need to pay more attention to what is inside the informality. And although state is considered as the regulator of informal activities, we see it actually produces and strategically uses informality for different political, economic, different goals. And on governance, we see there are different models of urban governance in China, India, and Brazil, shaping the redevelopment in very different ways. But if we want to have full development, the institution need to be both effective and inclusive. And on urbanization, so far, most literatures, most theories of urban studies actually are based on experiences in Western cities, their experiences of urbanization. But you see from our comparison, urbanization is not a linear process. It has different trajectories, different logics in different countries, and that's a reflection of their different pathways of national development. So we need to take history into serious account in understanding urban development and urbanization. And finally, I hope the study can also encourage us to think about what is a city. And so to think about that, I looked up one of the oldest dictionaries in the world, 说文解字. So you see this is the oldest Chinese dictionary written by Xu Sheng, a scholar of the East Han Dynasty. So in this dictionary, it says, 城以圣民也, right? So city is a place for people to thrive. I also found a quote from one of my favorite French thinker, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in The Social Contract. He says, the real meaning of this word, city, has been almost wholly lost in modern times. Most people mistake a town for a city and a townsman for a citizen. They don't know that houses make a town, but citizens make a city. So apparently the two scholars have never met each other because they were over 1,000 years apart. But we can see there's a shared humanistic, human-centered perspective in their understanding of what is the city. And I believe this perspective is still important today when we think about the cities and urbanization. So thank you. I'm going to end here, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Zhang, for the very, very inspiring. Sorry, somebody trying to call me. But no, thank you for that exciting talk. I invite people to put in their questions in the Q&A box, but I wanted to start it off with a question with regard to methods, because as you know, I've been working on the methods of doing China-India. And now you bring in a third place, which is in your case, Brazil. So methodologically speaking, one, how difficult it is to compare three different places, right? That's the difficulty, or perhaps in your case, easiness, because you have done that kind of work before. But the second issue is, what does this kind of comparison that is beyond two entities, right? You have three entities here, reveal, in your case, the issues of urbanization. Why is the third place necessary in comparison, or even a fourth place? I mean, you say that it's global south issues. All three cities are global south, but what if you bring in a fourth global north city, right? So where do we start the comparison and where we end? Is two not enough? That's why you need a third. Is three enough, or do you need a fourth? So, what kind of comparison is appropriate in your case with regard to different places?
So thank you, Tenzin. That's an excellent question. The methodological issue is related to theory building, is something I've been thinking about a lot too. So as a reflection of your question, so how we start comparison and where we end in terms of comparison. So actually, one major criteria I chose the cases is actually not really based on how many number of cases I want to have. It's actually based on the different types of informal settlements. So in other words, the unit of analysis in my study is actually the informal settlements or the redevelopment, right? The redevelopment projects in different cities in the informal settlements. And I use cities and countries as a site of comparison, but the unit of analysis are the redevelopment projects in the informal settlements. So when I choose my cases, I actually try to see, whether there are different types of informal settlements who show very different property ownership, developmental rules, and service provision. And then I found, China and India, as two largest developing countries, they provide rich ground, lots of interesting informality in their cities. But I found Brazil actually offers a new type of, informal settlements in terms of housing movements, in terms of how people use rights, to claim their ownership and then to challenge the state, which is actually something we do not see very often in other countries, especially in China and India. So that's basically the main criteria for me, to introduce another case. And I thought currently the four types basically covers, the major types of informality, especially the relations between state and the informal housing communities. So that's my major criteria. And also, I want to say, when I do the comparison, I really try to acknowledge the differences between the cases, especially I think pay enough attention to what the history of urbanization is in each country. I think that's super important. And then I try to show we can tease out the similarity despite their different culture and history and the political institutions. So that's basically my strategy of comparison.
Yeah, I see there's an expert on Bombay here in audience. Maybe she'll have a question about Bombay. But related to this issue of methods, the three countries that you talk about, Brazil, India, and China, are part of this BRICS countries, right?
Yeah.
So I wonder, other than you studying these three countries, or if if the BRICS grouping somehow talks about these kinds of urban issues, or is it a discussion among the multinational organizations that meet under the BRICS rubric? So my question is, are there people looking at addressing these issues when they come together? And there seems to be common issues, but also different states. Is there a way in which learning process takes place between the three regions, because they do have a platform, they have a forum where they come together, and then they share similar problems as well with regard to informality and urban issues. So is there a discourse, a learning process that happens among the three cities or the three countries you're talking place?
Yes.
And yeah,
Absolutely. So that's a great question. And so yes, as we know, there are all the BRIC countries, and we see the actually, we see the forums, between the leaders of those countries, including South Africa nowadays, right? Very often. But as far as I know, in terms of the national level exchanges, including the forums, it seems to me the focus is still at the national level issue, including, security, international exchanges, trade, commerce. So I would say it's more on a national level issue. So I think perhaps the focusing on the economic development on cities, I think would be a very promising direction for leaders in those countries. And but I think although you don't see lots of initiative from the national level, I think there are two supplement ways. One is, there are lots of international organizations, including the Asian Developmental Bank. I think the bank has done a lot to promote the exchange between cities, especially, among Asian cities between India and China, in terms of issues of economic development and how to conquer inequality, poverty in our cities. So I think that's one very good channel to tackle this issue. On the other hand, I actually see some informal or formal exchanges, including city diplomacy between the mayors in different countries, not only including the BRIC countries, but also other countries. I think that's also an important initiative to promote this kind of learning at the city level. And but I think one barrier is that you probably see more exchanges between Asian cities, due to the geography, right, due to the Asian Developmental Bank. But then in Latin America, you see maybe the exchange is more within that region, including the role of Inter-American Developmental Bank there. So I would say this cross-continental exchanges for cities can be more important. So we should pass this information to our prime ministers and presidents so they can make better policies.
Yes, if they listen to us. So, so there are a couple of questions here you see on the Q&A box, Changye. This is our incoming faculty, Sangeeta Banerjee. She works on Bombay. So her first question, I mean, both questions are related to the Dharavi redevelopment project. So she's asking this kind of this project, especially in Bombay, which is still on hold. What kind of informality or urban governance issues do you think it indicates the fact that it is on hold, right?
Right.
And I'll come to her second question, but maybe as a follow-up. So if you could answer the first question about the Dharavi redevelopment project in Bombay.
Oh, absolutely. So these are good questions. So, Dharavi redevelopment projects, it is actually something outside the general scheme of slum redevelopment, which I discussed in my work. So Dharavi redevelopment is actually treated as a separate project, and they have a totally different, state agency in charge of that. And I know the delay has been largely, due to, there's lots of fragmentation in the bureaucracy, for instance, who is responsible for what. I know the state has been holding, has been trying to organize the bidding process among developers for a long time, but they couldn't really choose a developer whose budget, whose plan really meet the demands of the state government. And also there was lots of disputes actually between residents of Dharavi and the developer and the state government. So you see, one thing is, like I mentioned, Dharavi has lots of micro industries, right? Like leather industry, pottery industry. So all those people living there, they actually have larger space, not only for living, but also for work, as workshops, as small factories. But if you go through the redevelopment, every resident will have a very standard size of living space. So oftentimes they are not able to have their workspace anymore. So they couldn't do their micro industry anymore. So that's one major challenge, for the government to push forward for this agenda. And I know that's also something they have been negotiating in terms of how much space people can have after redevelopment. And in addition to that, like I mentioned, the state government has been relatively slow due to the fragmentation between different bureaucratic agencies. They do not have enough, you don't have lots of action from the local governments, the city or the local wards. That's also a one major problem. You cannot push the problem down. You cannot push the program down to the grassroots level. Compared to China, that's a difference in implementation. So I would say Those are the major problems. But I know it has been on hold, and I heard from the news, they recently seems they selected a developer. So maybe the projects will be going on fairly soon. So we'll have to see.
So it's connected, the second question, Changye, also
Mhm.
from Sangeeta, right? But there seems to be a vibrant people who are part of this discussion that takes place, right? I mean, there are people who are asserting their rights with regard to the Dharavi project, and they are sometimes successful in stalling the projects, development projects, right? I would add a question to that. Are there similar things in Brazil and Guangzhou as well? A vibrant group of people who are trying to assert their rights and are successful installing these kinds of state redevelopment projects or not. That's my addition to Sangeeta's question. And then the second part is, there are also similar to in China, urban villages within Indian cities. How would you compare that kind of urban villages to, let's say, in China? I don't know if Brazil also have those kinds of urban villages. So the first part is, the right to protest, the asserting of rights, and in the case of Dharavi being successful installing it, and Sangeeta then points out the developer has now gone bankrupt. Um, we see this kind of thing in China, for example, where people in Guangzhou would have a voice with regard to asserting their rights, or do they have any rights?
Absolutely. So, okay, so we have a couple of questions here. I'll try to address each of them. One is about the right to protest, right? So absolutely, you actually see that across all the three countries in the major cities. But I would say the difference is perhaps, the different scales of protest, different scales of social movements. So for instance, you will see people are using the term rights, in China, also in India, and also in Brazil. But like I showed you, in Brazil, it actually has developed into a social movement where people have the organization to systematically challenge, the state for over decades. And that is something actually different. Actually, Mumbai used to have a social movements tradition. Professor Mark Pfizer at the New School has a really good book about, he compares social movements in, I think in the early 20th century, right? In India, in Mumbai and in Shanghai, due to the textile workers. But actually the history was the textile workers a demonstration in Mumbai was crashed by the state. And after that, you see the decline of the textile sector, and then you do not see, organized workers' movements anymore in Mumbai or in India. And similar thing, in China, now the workers, you don't really have unions. So the collective action, I think in those two countries are relatively weaker compared to what you see in Brazil. But I agree with you, people have been using rights as a banner to struggle in all different national contexts. Although the specific actions are different. Even in urban villages in China, like I told you, the villagers, they have lots of bargaining power because they own the land, they have their clan, they have their committees, right? They have their shareholding companies. However, if you look at the role of the migrant workers in urban villages in China, I was surprised. There's almost no action from the migrant tenants. Although they are the majority of people living there, although they don't receive any, compensation or any even not really, notice before redevelopment. But there's no collective action, no challenge from the tenants. And lots of them just consider they don't have the rights to do so because they don't own the land, they don't have the hukou. So I would say this is also different resources, tools people can use. And so in other words, I think we need to differentiate, how people use rights in their struggle. And also something very important in India, I think, as some of you know, after India passed the amendment to the constitution, there is this, large number of NGOs appearing in the country, and some of them actually are working with the slum dwellers. So the NGOs also play an important role in urban India. And then, yes, there are urban villages in India too. I visited some of them, especially in Delhi. And but I think one major difference is that I don't see collective economy in urban villages in India. In other words, they don't have their collective properties. They don't really have shareholding companies to claim their economic rights. That's something different between China and India. And also, I think one issue was the developer went bankrupt. Yes, it's also a global issue, especially during the pandemic when the economy slows down. As you know, in China, the Evergrande bankruptcy was one major issue, right? The largest real estate company in China just went bankrupt and has large amount of debt. So that actually urges the Chinese government to slow down its land financing, to put more control over the real estate sector. But those changes are still in progress. Did I miss anything from the questions?
No, that's good. And Everbright was based in Guangdong, right? I think in Guangzhou itself. But this is another question from Kelvin Chen, who is asking about relocation. What happens during the process of relocation? And he's asking about India and Brazil, but I think it's it pertains to Guangzhou as well and China more broadly. There is some loss that happens with regard to relocation, with regard to space and freedom, he says, with the strict regulations about where you can move or how you can move. But his question is the relocation worth the cost of the people who are being moved? Are they fine with the relocation process? The cultures, he says, get lost, and this means the whole way of life that existed pre-relocation somehow then disappears after the move. So it's basically a cultural side of things. It's not just about moving from one place to another, but what gets lost, culturally speaking, in this relocation process.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's a good observation. So we see, relocation has been a very dramatic social, political, economic, and cultural process, as you mentioned. It's actually not only something peculiar in the global South. If you look at what happens in North America in the post-World War II era, urban removal, urban redevelopment, urban renewal all over this country. And so actually there's actually lots of studies on the psychology of people, how renewal influence people's psychology. People call it as uproots effects on people. It damages the community. And I would say for the people in my study, that's particularly an important issue, because for the slum dwellers or the urban villagers, many of them have a strong attachment to their communities. There are a couple of reasons. The culture and their community sense of identity is important. But also for some of the slum dwellers, it is also economically important for them to live there, because many of the the communities I study, they are centrally located. So they can have access to resources, access to jobs in the city, access to the market. And so once the community was redeveloped, many of them were pushed to areas further away from the city, or they were put into apartments, although on the same spot, but very, very tiny space. So they cannot continue their economic activities anymore. So I remember I was seeing a survey done in about 17 Indian cities recently, including Mumbai. So the survey person asked the slum dwellers, do you want to leave? If you have a chance to leave, to move out of the slum, do you want to? And the majority of people's answer is no, I don't want to leave the slum, for the reason of economic convenience and the community, that kind of reason that I mentioned. So I just want to show you, yes, so redevelopment and removal can cause issue for those communities. And you see, it's tricky because in the 50s and 70s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, when we see redevelopment, the demolition of informal settlements in different countries, including Brazil, the pattern was to demolish the community and build new housing for them in the urban periphery, very different location. And nowadays, you see in both India and China, the development plan is to house those people on the same land, right? They didn't change location, but still the conditions have been changed. So I think we need to pay attention to this new development in terms of displacement within the same location.
That's great. I mean, this is connected to the next question that Chao Chin Chao is asking. One is, of course, the policy issues, right? That how do you address the resettlement issues and come up with the informal settlements? But there is a historical process of urbanization without the policy. Policies come perhaps later on. But how would you see this process of urbanization from villages to towns to cities, which has a huge historical precedent, right? I mean, that's how urbanization takes place. How would you use that process of urbanization as a comparative tool, right? Without looking just at as the policy issues, can we use the process of urbanization in China, India, and Brazil, also within a comparative framework without going to the policy as something that the state does? But I think her question is about the process of urbanization. Can that be used comparatively among the three societies you are talking about? And she has a second part that we'll discuss after this.
Okay, great. Hi, Chao. It's great to see you, and thank you for the questions. So I'll answer the first question first. So I think two things. One thing is, like I mentioned in my lecture, history indeed is very important. And I think the main argument I try to make is that there is not a single linear process of urbanization, right? It's not not every country will urbanize in a way as the United States or as the UK. You see different, European countries, Asian countries, countries in Latin America, in Africa, they actually will urbanize in very different ways. In China, if you want to understand how Chinese cities have been developed, you must understand the issue of land financing, and and also the hukou system is important, right? If you want to understand urbanization in India, you must understand that there was a mentality to control urbanization back to the 50s by the leaders. Even if we go back to Gandhi, his thought was, India's future is in villages, it's not in cities. So you see, you need to take into account all the historical factors in order to understand how policymakers make the policies today and shape their cities. So that's one argument I try to make. So indeed, history matters in this analysis. And actually in my book, I have one chapter in the study of each country to discuss what is their history of urbanization and how the history influences the formation of different informal settlements. So the typology I developed was mainly to explain their different models of redevelopment in current day. So that's not to explain history, it's mainly to explain the process of redevelopment or the relations between state and society. And of course, the typology was also influenced by their historical development too. Let's see.
The second part.
Yeah, sure.
The second part is about the informal settlements in particular that you have been talking about with regard to Guangzhou, right? And then her question is, are they applicable to other Chinese cities as well, or not? Is Guangzhou an exception, or do you see that process happening in other places, especially in tier 2 cities, for example?
Absolutely, yeah. So that's also a question, comes a lot from other colleagues when I give the talks. People will talk about, you study Mumbai, is the largest city in India. How can that inform our understanding, of Delhi or of Varanasi, other smaller cities? Same for China and Brazil. So my answer is that this is a qualitative study, right? So I don't think my cases are representative in terms of the statistical sense. So in other words, the function of those qualitative study of the cases is to help us identify the major patterns of development in different contexts. And I would say there is a high level of generalizability based on the typology. So for instance, in China, if I use China as one example, Guangzhou is different from Shanghai, different from Beijing. However, you see urban villages all over China. So you see similar patterns of how informality has been produced over the country. And similar in India, squatter settlements is also in different parts of the country too. And also, although there is a difference between North China and South China in terms of social organization, economic development, you also see this kind of directive governance imposed by the state is also consistent all over the country. Although I think there are some local level variations, but I think the typology can help us understand the larger picture of development in the country. And then we need to take into account some local level variation. And similar thing, a very interesting example is India. Although I said many Indian cities, I think would fall in the category of transactional model, right? There's lots of negotiation, the clientelistic between the state and the civil society. But actually, one of the Indian state, Kerala, as Tencent probably knows, in South India, is actually considered a social democracy. It has one of the highest level of urbanization in the country, but there's almost no slum, because the governance, including the Communist Party there, their long tradition of valuing education, social welfare provision. So that state has a pretty high level of public goods provision among all the Indian states. So lots of scholars argue Kerala is actually a social democracy in India. So indeed, there is the variation, but the purpose of typology is to show what's the general pattern at the national scale.
I think there's a study that perhaps you can do after this is comparing Kerala and perhaps Guangdong or another province in China and see how it goes. Because I think, as I've told you a number of times before, that people just settle for these large cities. So I'm trying to convince Sangeeta to do something on her town. She comes from Jamshedpur and Harbin as industrial towns in China and India when she comes and joins us at NYU Shanghai. But I wanted to ask you one factor that you mentioned, that religion plays a role in São Paulo in Brazil. There are religious groups. I wonder if the same is true in Dharavi, and I'm sure there's a lack of that kind of religious participation in Guangzhou. So what is the religious factor, if you see the comparison from the point of view with Brazil, starting from Brazil and looking back at China and India, and how that matters or does not matter, or the lack of it, I mean, especially in Guangzhou, does it matter at all, the religious factor?
Oh, yeah, so that's a great question. Yes, so about the issue of religion, there are a couple of things. First of all, indeed, we see religion plays a stronger role in Brazil than in India or China in organizing people. So like I mentioned, the liberation theology, right? So the idea is that the poor should be organized, should liberate themselves. And also there was lots of teaching on this issue. Even today, you see the Christian churches actually still play a very important role in organizing social mobilization. And in China, of course, is one extreme where you almost don't see the influence of religion, for the political reasons. And then India is actually quite interesting here. The role of religion. I didn't really mention that. But I think there are a couple of things we can look at. One is there's the divide between the Hindus and the Muslims in India, right? So we know some of the regional parties, including Shiv Sena, is actually claimed to be a Hindu nationalist party. So to present the interests of of Hindu society. So this kind of party has historically been a divider, using religion as a tool to divide the society. And the purpose, of course, is to appeal to its own constituents, right? To get votes from people of the same group, of same religious ethnic group. But actually now we see some changes in the sense that even the Shiv Sena party they want to appeal to Muslim residents as well. So maybe, you know, in terms of this boundary, I think it has been blurred a little bit. And another interesting thing is I found in the redevelopment of slums in Mumbai, developers told me they often have to build separate buildings for the Hindus and for the Muslims, right? Because sometimes people don't want to live in the same building, and sometimes it's okay. So developers actually take religions into serious account, maybe more so than politicians, I would say. So in other words, I think I want to say, you know, religion historically can be used as a tool to divide the society, but also in the process of redevelopment, it's really negotiate, you know, lots of economic different issues are intertwined, so the picture can be more complicated. And also I want to go back to what Tencent said earlier about the importance of studying smaller cities. And indeed, so, you know, we see lots of statistics showing most highest level of future population growth actually are not in the mega cities, not in Mumbai or Shanghai, actually are in the secondary or even the third level smaller cities. So I think it's very important for us to understand how politics works, not only in the big cities, but also in the smaller cities. So yes, I look forward to studying more about Kerala.
Yeah, that's great. And I think there are lots of other very interesting issues that as your book comes out, you can go around the world and promoting the study of urban issues because there are other factors like unemployment, disparity among rich and poor, those kinds of issues that show up, which will be important factor in doing these kinds of comparative urban studies. So I would like to thank you, Zhang, for spending this morning with us with this wonderful talk. And we await you to finish your book, publish it, and come to Shanghai and do a book launch for us. And I'm sure there will be a Chinese edition of that as well, which will be quite useful. So thank you, Zhang. Thank you, everybody, for coming and participating. We'll be putting this talk on our YouTube channel. And I hope to see you in Chicago at some point, Changye.
Yes. Oh, so thank you, Tencent, for the invitation, for such a great, you know, organizing work of everything. And also thank audience for all your excellent questions. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. I had a great time. Thank you so much, Tencent, and
Thank
hope to
you.
see you soon, either in Chicago, Shanghai, or New York.
Yes. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.